No, we were talking about how hard it is to keep a sincere voice and not go out on tangents or chase things that are not true to your own voice. And I think if I feel good about one thing is that I'm avoiding that, and there's some continuity in the work that, whether it's paintings or photographs or sculpture, speak to the same thing. I think for me, maybe the most pivotal aspect of the language that I'm trying to work with, of building things in the studio and then placing them in nature, is to try to create a narrative that's about individuals or families or lineage, or and that somehow by placing things in nature, it fills out the story. It fills out the story on how people are living. You know, it talks about the materials or the situation they might be in, and the intent really is to create some type of poetry that people can relate to, and that they can have their own imagined narrative from their experiences. Whether they have similar experiences or experiences that have nothing to do with the content that I'm thinking about, it doesn't really matter. If it somehow brings out an emotive response, that's the result that I'm looking for. So just outside of the town where I lived, there was two houses that were sort of back to back, and they were two sisters, twins. One of the houses, there was always a goat tethered to the porch. There was chickens in the yard, and the earth around the house was bare. And the shacks it was two shacks, and they were back to back with a space between them of a couple of yards. The houses were unpainted and worn, and they were rich in grays and browns and blacks, and they fascinated me somehow. Once I was driving, I would stop occasionally or a couple of times to offer them a ride, and they always sort of waved me off curtly. But I was always fascinated by their house, and it was my father told me that after their mother had died, or their father had died, their parents, they somehow had someone cut the house that was there in half because they couldn't maintain together in one house, and the house was split and porches were added, and they were sort of back to back facing opposite directions. Twin sisters and twin houses. Sometimes you'd see them sitting on the porch in the late afternoon facing opposite directions. I think growing up outside of a small town, I mean a town of 500 people, really small town, when other kids were fantasizing about being baseball players or basketball players or football players or whatever, somehow at an early age, like 11, 12, I was looking at books of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and that's where my fantasies came from. So it was an early age. And then also I was such a disaster in school, but the fact that I drew really well would give me positive responses, a lot of reinforcement for that, because it was the one thing that I had that was noteworthy. So I think early on I knew I was an artist. And also being from a place that was parochial was nice, because I was able to be naive enough to think it was a realistic path to follow. Maybe if I'd known more, I would have done something else, but somehow it was easy to imagine and fantasize about being an artist from an early age. You know, when I first started to paint with some passion and some freedom, really not until my mid to late 20s, one of the things I focused on was the horizon line, and it somehow was a metaphor for me for where man met nature. And then I started to use icons of human existence, whether it was a fence line or a clothesline with clothes hanging off of it, or a house or a shack or a chair in a field. It still somehow represents or is a metaphor for where we meet and interact with nature. Usually the beginning of a piece will be as simple as a line drawing that will give me an idea or be a guide, and then as I'm going along, especially if I'm having a helper or something like that, I'll draw more detailed drawings of how things join together. I work a lot with scale, so keeping in mind the scale of the structure when it's going to go out and be in nature is really important as I'm in the studio, because I like these things to read as real or potentially real buildings. There's a lot of instinct, and the reason that's important to me is that if you're instinctual and you're moving through a piece or through a body of work instinctually, it sort of supersedes getting too locked in and formalistic, and I think work benefits from that. That if you get too crystalline about what you're doing or too intentional with not allowing new information to come in, not allowing yourself to shift in the process, then you're eliminating possible evolution. And to me, evolution in work is very important. The evolution in the movement and the change in the work is elemental to be drawn forward. It's what keeps me inspired and intrigued by the work. I think if I sat back too much on what I had done in the past, that it would just be harder for me to push forward. We were talking about how the images showed up in the paintings first, and that then I was abstracting houses and using houses as icons to represent us, basically. And then at some point I decided to build some maquettes, and I was still living in New York City. I think a little bit of it was a yearning to get back to the kind of environment I had grown up in, but I started to make the three-dimensional houses and bas-relief houses, and moved to upstate and continued that work, was able to enlarge it because I had a big studio. And at some point, looking at the landscape based paintings, and then looking at the sculptures, it just hit me that the sculptures needed to return to the landscape. So it's an interesting process. It's threefold, really. It's the paintings, the sculpture, and then the photography, and they all relate. I think they relate well to each other. To me, it's the same theme. think when I was making these sculptures in New York in various studios and living among the hustle and the bustle, I think this imagery that had so much to do with the narrative of my childhood and illustrated everything from disparity, economic disparity, race disparity, opportunity, all these things, these sociological threads that are, innate in how I think about this work, that in the city, it was always like I wanted to get back to that on some level. And in a way, making these things and then selling them afforded me the ability to buy this property. There's a children's book where there's a guy that paints chickens that lives in New York City, and one day a limousine pulls up and it's a woman who buys all of his paintings of chickens, and then he's able to move from New York. I think he moved to Maine and bought a farm. But I always thought that a little bit the work I was doing and the fact that I was able to sell enough to buy this place and renovate it, it's kind of magical.
You want to set up the boxes now and then just so we have a
couple boxes under the bottom, and then we're going to line that stand up and bolt it on. Then we're going to walk it up this way and forward. We're going to pull it, put it in position to my camera. Back when I was a kid, we had a woman named Catherine that would work for us to help my mother in the house. And sometimes my father would give her a ride home, and I would ride with him. And I was always fascinated by the houses that were on that road. They were up on stilts. They were all unpainted, made from culled wood from the mill. They had a certain sadness. They had sunken roofs and barely had windows and no porches, bare earth yards. And one day in particular, my mother had gathered some clothes that no longer fit any of us. And as we were going down the dirt track by the shacks behind the sawmill to her house, my father said to me, "You should help Catherine take the clothes into the house." So that's how I saw the inside of Catherine's house. It was just a one-room shack with culled boards from the sawmill, worn and gray, a tin roof, 3 steps braced by cinder blocks up to the house. The yard was bare from all the kids and the chickens and the activity in the yard. When we opened the door, I realized there was no electricity, no light. There was only light from a back window. There was a couple of kerosene lamps that they used at night. There was a couple of people in the house. There was one of her daughters sitting with a baby on the floor in the corner. So as I was standing there sort of gaping at what I was seeing, all of a sudden I felt Catherine tugging at the bag in my arms. And she looked at me and then grabbed my chin and pulled my face to hers. And she said to me, "You should never forget this." I think I want to try to bolt it. I think I want to just bolt over there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just, as long as this is one unit, I don't care.
It'll be fine.
It's really fine. You don't have to. You can over crank it after.
You can put like 6 washes on that. Then you have to
To me, there's not a big stretch between a house on a dirt road, whether it's in the south of the U.S. or in the Caribbean or Latin America, Asia, up on stilts, that the houses really, to me, are a form of sculpture.
All right, we're pretty close though, guys.
Yeah.
So let's just lift her up.
Yeah.
All right, slow.
Yep. That might be good right there. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Better.
That's a little bit better.
I think we could go a little further. Maybe.
I got a couple flat rocks under the side. So there's a lot of dynamic about what a house is and how it relates to environmental issues now and to nature as a threat, or it's much more organic and relates to being part of nature. I think that's why I'm drawn to houses that are made with less resources, that are, outside of cities, and that they grow or they develop in a way that's very organic and makes them, to me, very sculptural and full of narrative and full of story. You can read the personality and the history and the dynamic of the inhabitants much more than, say, a glass and steel tower. But when I'm making or looking at houses or photographing houses that fall into that realm, it's very much a commentary also on modern architecture and contrast to that. So it's not necessarily just voyeurism in a vacuum. It's commentary on other choices we make.
On the flip,
Yeah.
and I'm only guaranteed to win 100. So I'm
Same as red or black, like Jerry's explaining.
So I'm losing $10 on purpose.
Here, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
No, if you win your bet, you get paid $100. You don't give them 110 and get 100. You just get 100.
Yeah,
You only pay them if you lose.
That's what we were talking about before.
Oh, so you would win $100.
Yeah, but you'd risk 110.
Oh, I get it. I see.
Like right now, I'm working on a large fence line that is a vehicle for me to think about borders and immigration and migration and issues that we all face in the world right now. And I think it's also, you know,
A little bit more than that.
it's an icon, like the houses are icons. There's some information there about how we live and how we relate to the world.
Yeah. So if you were betting on Leo to win the Oscar, it would be like you would win like $100,
For
but
every
if you
two
lost, you'd have to pay. What was it, like something
Two
ridiculous?
grand.
Yeah. All right. Nice.
That's just exactly
It was
how-
interesting to return a piece to the city where it was made years ago and put it in different environments and look at it and just sort of see how it contrasted with the feeling of the city as opposed to a more isolated rural setting. And New York so dwarfs anything that I do that it overwhelms it. It's not that it's totally lost in this situation, but it's a different life. It's a different life that exists in the city as opposed to the life that might exist in this imagined scenario of these houses.
$10 to win 55.
So it's part of the dialogue that I work with is that contrast.
Oh yeah, there's you can bet on how long the national anthem's gonna take.
There's something about everything from a McMansion to a shack that somehow reflects their culture and the momentum of our evolution. So often I kind of look back at vernacular architecture and it informs the future.
Why? You don't want me to hang out with you? No, we want to get the house off. Oh.
No, it's okay. We're waiting for Josh to finish his hill sprint.
We were waiting for...
And you were asking about individual pieces. It has the basis for a lot of the individual pieces is that I have a running narrative or story or history or a sense of nostalgia for either a particular place or a sensibility in general that mostly stems from childhood and storytelling and memory, and how looking back sometimes can be almost a reflective surface to allow you to look forward or to assess what's happening in the present, or maybe even comment on the direction, not only in society but also in art. What really is currency in making art or in living a life. So in kind of a vague way, without being too preachy or whatever, I think that's the subtext of what I do.